So here's something super interesting that basically just flew under my radar completely, but this is really interesting. So this is something that Joe Rogan said. Now, it's interesting because Joe Rogan may have just exposed Candace Owens and Dave Rubin without saying it explicitly. It's literally impossible to not apply what he said to those specific people, and possibly more, but I'm pretty sure it's Dave and Candace. Now, it's very likely it's Dave and Candace for a couple of reasons. Now, he's had conversations with both Dave Rubin and Candace Owens. He's had multiple talks with Dave Rubin. I recommend you watch some of those, at least like skim through them, because upon seeing some of the clips of stuff prior to the one where he got dunked on in the whole building regulation thing, where Dave Rubin just totally got mauled by Joe Rogan and just, I hate to say this word, but educated on building regulations, because Dave Rubin doesn't know what he's talking about. Apparently, he was also getting like mauled big time on all the other podcasts that he would do with him, like where they talked about some of the Charlottesville stuff. It was pretty, Joe Rogan kind of put out in very clear terms, what exactly the whole reasoning for all the stuff was, and he was just educating him completely. So definitely Dave Rubin, based on what you're going to hear him say, but also on top of that, I think Candace Owens as well. And I think Candace Owens because, again, the logic that and reasoning Joe Rogan is going to provide is 100% compatible and fits basically Candace Owens' entire ideology to a T. And as you guys know, Joe Rogan had Candace Owens on his podcast, and oh boy, did that go bad. So I think like somewhere halfway through, when Candace Owens explains her turn to being a conservative, I think he started to realize how much of a fraud Candace was, because none of the rationale and logic she was giving for anything was making sense. But on top of that, as they started to delve into other things about specifically climate change, by the way, I really recommend you go check that out if you haven't already checked out the infamous climate change debate between Candace Owens and Joe Rogan, because it was just another smackdown by Joe Rogan. And that podcast is when I really realized, because I used to think Tommy Lahren was the dumbest right-wing pundit, but then Candace Owens easily took that mantle as soon as that podcast hit, where there was the climate change debate. That at that point I knew she was so dumb, because she was like, oh, well, this isn't a .org, it's a .com, so I don't trust it, which is like, what? And then Joe Rogan brings up a .org, and then she doesn't trust that either, and then she has this weird conspiracy that the website is polling their own people instead of citing polls about scientists. Like, what are you talking about? And she goes, I went on a tear reading about it, and it's very obvious that she has no clue what on earth she's talking about, because she simply just doesn't know anything about climate change or virtually anything else. So I really recommend you guys go check out that podcast, because he hasn't had her on since, and he has a lot of repeat guests on. So there's a chance she'll be on again. I doubt it, highly doubt it. I would be really surprised if he does have her on again, because the way that he reacted was sort of like, what the hell? Who the hell is this person? So what you're going to be seeing here is Joe Rogan. He's going to be talking about the political sphere in general and giving his breakdown and analysis. But I'm just going to show you guys a quick clip of what he says, exposing frauds on the political right who simply switch sides for monetary gains and other types of gains. So check this out.
And that this is possible, that people can realize that there's some stupidity to this team mentality that we have.
Right.
This right versus left, which is almost all, a good percentage of it is these assumed identities, right? These predetermined patterns that get adopted in order to, as we first started talking about this, in order to establish yourself as someone who's in a group.
Right.
You get accepted by this group. And you see it left and right. I mean, I don't want to name any names, but there's a bunch of people that do it blatantly. You see them, and I've even seen them switch teams. And you see them switch teams, and I don't buy their rationalizations when it comes to ideology. What I think is what they're doing is they're switching teams because they realize there's an in on this team.
Right.
And they can just say, this is the problem with the team I used to be on. Those fucking losers. And they're really Benedict Arnold, right? And like they probably have as much of an affinity to the ideas of one side as they do the other side. They just go all in on one side to get acceptance from the group.
Right.
There's no way people change their opinion that much over 2 years or something like that. Or, it's like they just decide this group makes more sense now. And I've been attacked by people on the left, so I'm going to go to the right, or vice versa. And usually what it is, I mean, even when they say they've been attacked, like, oh, you fucking baby, there's 300 million people just in this country alone. If you put something out there publicly and 1,000 people attack you, don't act like you're being persecuted. Okay, you have an idea, you've launched that idea out into the zeitgeist, and people took a big shit on it. Whether it's people on the right or people on the left, you got to be able to argue your point one way or the other, and not just immediately jump ship when someone who shares ideas with you decides that your idea sucks. And maybe they're wrong, and maybe you're right, but you got to argue that through. But this idea of these partisan patterns that people just seem to automatically fall into, they're so detrimental to dialogue.
Yeah, so you guys heard Joe Rogan, man. What he said is, how does your ideology change that much in 2 years? And we've seen Dave Rubin's ideology switch, basically flip on its head in a span of 2 years, where he went from being a supporter of Bernie Sanders. We showed you guys the clip a while ago now. It's been like a year, almost like a year now at this point, of Dave Rubin on Bernie Sanders pre-Coke dollars and then post-Coke dollars. He even incorrectly labeled Bernie Sanders a socialist. So he supported someone who he incorrectly labeled as a socialist. So steel manning him, let's say he hypothetically was a socialist, which he's not. Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. He said that he supported a socialist, right? And now he makes videos titled "Socialism Isn't Cool," and he makes videos saying he's a classical liberal and why he left the left, which is, classical liberalism is a hyper laissez-faire economical ideology, so it doesn't make any sense. And that also applies to, by the way, Candace Owens. And now here's what I'm going to say. He's 100%, no doubt in my mind, even in the slightest, talking about Candace Owens here, 100%. However, he also may be thinking about Dave Rubin. It's a bit tougher to believe that, because he has had Dave Rubin as a repeat guest, I think like 3 times on. But dude, it is totally possible because of the smackdowns we've seen laid down by Joe Rogan during the podcast that he has with Dave Rubin. I mean, you guys remember where Dave Rubin was on with the whole building regulations fiasco, if you will, where Dave Rubin's like, well, do you want, the government telling you to put your light here and then, the wall over here and yada yada. And then Joe Rogan's like, and the funny thing about that is they were having like a little bit of like almost like a jerk off session about, oh, these liberals, the estate tax. Oh, like, how do you rant about the estate tax? Dude, that barely affects anybody. And then he just went too far for Joe Rogan, where he started to advocate against building regulations. And it's because Dave Rubin doesn't know what he's talking about. And he says, intellectually, I like that argument. Like, are you 5? Like, are you 13? How old are you to where you're making intellectual arguments over actual, empirical arguments of what actually goes on in the real world? Like, are you 13? I honestly have no idea, but it's pretty laughable just how dumb Dave Rubin is. And he was basically saying that, well, I believe that Snapchat can take place of building regulations and any type of regulations, which is hilarious on the face of it. It's almost like a clown, a political clown making a joke unironically. And then Joe Rogan had to lay the smackdown on him, saying, hey, no, you can't just have the free market do regulations. Buildings need to have strict building codes that are made by people who are qualified, and it must, it becomes a risk to not just themselves, that specific house, but the entire neighborhood, if a fire is caused or a flood of some sort, some kind of disaster is caused. And also the homes, these problems don't necessarily just show up right away. They can take time to manifest, and people live in houses for a long time. And so the idea that people won't cut corners because they want to do good work is just empirically false. There's a false connection made there that they want to do good work because it'll lead to more profit. That would assume people act rationally, but really the truth is people just do whatever they can to make profit. They're not incentivized necessarily to do good work. They're just incentivized to make money. So no, Dave Rubin, Yelp is not going to be a substitute for for building regulations. I can't believe he even said that. It's unbelievable. But that's Dave Rubin's case. Now, Candace Owens, he's obviously talking about Candace Owens, because if you go back and watch the video of the podcast where Candace Owens is breaking down her political awakening, he realizes how BS her quote-unquote awakening was, because it literally doesn't make any logical sense. I recommend you go check that out. It would lead to the conclusion of the opposite of what she came to, and she just utilized that. And obviously, we've exposed Candace Owens on multiple occasions. She was basically someone who was a massive SJW liberal who, after her ridiculous social autopsy, like public doxing site, completely fell flat on its face because left and right united to come out against it. She was too crazy for the left herself. And so just like that, in a snap, Mom, Dad, I'm conservative. Like, it's so obvious. It's so obvious. And if you think about it, I mean, like, business-wise, if you're to completely take out morals, ethics, and any sort of dignity in any way, shape, or form, where you just don't care at all, it's a good business move, because I think I just saw her picture with Trump. And she's making the big bucks. Apparently she's got Coke donors lined up to donate $100,000 to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign if she is to do a debate. And I mean, that just makes her even more of a hypocrite, because recall that, you know, she backed out of a debate with Kyle Kalinske because she just wasn't ready for it. But she pestered AOC to try and debate her, to give her money from these dirty Coke donors of $100,000. It's insane. And so Joe Rogan just absolutely went in on these clowns and frauds in Dave Rubin and Candace Owens. And I'm glad to see it. You know, obviously he's not going to name names for obvious reasons, but we know who the hell he's talking about. Let's keep it real here.